When you picture ancient Greeks kicking back with a glass of wine, you probably imagine something pretty similar to what we pour today, right? A nice red, maybe a crisp white. Well, the reality is their wine was a completely different drink, made for a completely different world.
So let's just chew on this question for a second. What if the stuff that fueled the great philosophers and epic poets wasn't really wine at all? What if it was more like a potent, syrupy concentrate that you could never, ever drink straight?
To really get why, we have to start with the #1 problem that every single winemaker in the ancient world was up against.
And that one singular challenge? Vinegar. You see, before modern bottling and all our fancy preservation tricks, any contact with oxygen would immediately start turning their precious wine into, well, vinegar. So their main job wasn't about taste or terroir. It was a desperate race to stop their drink from spoiling.
So how'd they fight back? Their solution was to make wine with a ridiculously high alcohol content. We're talking somewhere between 16 and 18%. At that level, the alcohol itself acts as a powerful natural preservative, killing off the very bacteria that wants to ruin the whole batch. And they got there by using grapes with a ton of sugar and letting them ferment for a long time, sometimes leaving the juice and skins together for months. This process squeezed out every last drop of sugar and flavor, creating this thick, super alcoholic wine concentrate. But, high alcohol was only part one of the plan. They also had to build a fortress against that mortal enemy of wine, oxygen. And that meant designing some very specific containers. And it all came down to two key pieces of tech: the massive pithos for fermenting the wine and the iconic amphora for moving it around. Two totally different vessels for two very different but equally important jobs.
Okay, first up, the pithos. These things were enormous earthenware jars. I mean, sometimes so big they'd actually bury them partly in the ground to keep them stable. Their whole design was perfect for that slow, months-long fermentation we talked about, keeping the wine safe and limiting its exposure to the air. Then, once the wine was finally ready in the pithos, it got transferred into these, the amphorae. You can think of these as the shipping containers of the ancient world. They were smaller, way easier to handle, and absolutely essential for aging, selling, and hauling that finished wine concentrate all across the Mediterranean. Now, here's a really cool detail. Terracotta is naturally a bit porous, so to make the amphorae totally airtight and waterproof, the Greeks would coat the entire inside with pine resin. A brilliant solution, right? But it came with a very, very distinct side effect. Yep, that resin gave the wine a strong, piney flavor. And believe it or not, this ancient taste has actually survived. If you've ever tried a glass of Retsina, that traditional Greek resinated wine, you have tasted a direct, living link to the winemaking practices from thousands of years ago. How cool is that? Okay, so they've made this incredibly potent, pine-flavored wine concentrate. The big question is, how did they actually drink it? Well, this brings us to the cultural heart of it all. The Symposium. And this symposium wasn't just some wild party. No, it was a pretty structured event where men would get together to debate politics, talk philosophy, recite poetry, all that good stuff. And right at the center of it all, connecting everything, was the wine. So this brings up a whole new problem, doesn't it? If their wine is this 16 to 18% alcohol bomb, how on earth could they possibly drink it for hours and hours during these long evenings without just passing out cold? The answer is all about this thing right here, the crater. This was a big mixing bowl, and it was always the centerpiece of the symposium. And here's the key. The wine concentrate from the amphora was never, ever served directly. It was always brought to the crater first. Because, and this is the big reveal, the Greeks almost never drank their wine neat. Drinking undiluted wine was considered barbaric. Instead, they'd pour the concentrate into the crater and then cut it with water, sometimes even cooled with snow from the mountains. They might even toss in some honey or herbs for extra flavor. What they were really drinking was basically a custom-made wine cocktail, mixed just right for the occasion. And get this, look how sophisticated they were about it. This is a Psychter. It's basically a mushroom-shaped wine cooler. They would pack it with snow and then float it right in the middle of the crater to keep the whole batch of mixed wine perfectly chilled all night long. This whole process was a true art form, and it was all managed by a guy called the Symposiarca. Think of him as the master of ceremonies, or an ancient sommelier. It was his job to decide the perfect wine-to-water ratio for the night,
maybe a stronger mix for a rowdy celebration, or a much weaker one for a serious night of philosophical debate. And hey, if you still have any doubt about just how powerful this undiluted concentrate really was, we have the perfect and probably most famous example from Homer's Odyssey.
So when Odysseus is trapped in the cave of the Cyclops, Polyphemus, he doesn't have a weapon big enough to kill the giant. But he does have something else up his sleeve: his ship's supply of that pure, undiluted wine concentrate. He offers it to the monster, pretending it's just a friendly gift. Well, the Cyclops has no idea what he's dealing with and just chugs it straight. After only 3 cups of the pure, unmixed stuff, the giant just passes out drunk. This is what allows Odysseus and his men to blind him and make their escape. It wasn't just wine, it was literally a weapon.
All right, so let's put it all together. The ancient Greek wine we've been talking about was a completely different beast from what we drink. It was a high alcohol concentrate made that way to survive. It was preserved in special jars, often tasted like pine resin, and, most importantly, it was almost always diluted in a crater to be the social centerpiece of the Symposium. It really makes you think, doesn't it? We take something as basic as a glass of wine for granted. But if our modern idea is so totally different from the ancient reality, it just leaves you with this one huge question. What else from the ancient world do we think we know, but have completely and utterly backwards?